A very good afternoon, everyone. I have rephrased my presentation, the title as A Century of Displacement, Territorial Encroachment and Constitutional Erosion, the Kuki Experience in Manipur. Well, ladies and gentlemen, and the press, we stand before you today not to trade accusations, not to escalate the tension, and not to beg for sympathy. We stand here to place the facts on record, and here on this table, document the facts, record the facts, and these facts that I talk about are drawn from the royal chronicles, colonial gazetteers, parliamentary debates, census records, and constitutional provisions. And most recently, from the blood of our people that is still fresh on the ground. Well, before I move on to my presentation, let me make this very clear. Kuki Jo versus Métis, that is what the discourse says. And the present conflict between the Kuki or the Kukizos and the Doungel NSCI-IM-led conflict. Let us understand the difference. First, the Kukis and the Métis. This conflict was a community versus a state-sponsored ethnic violence against a community. Whereas the present conflict between the Kukis and the Doungel Naga NSCI-IM-led is a conflict between two communities. And I am emboldened enough to say that, yes, there is no state, or at least at the surface level, no involvement of the state. And that is what makes the difference. Now imagine the institution of a new government in Manipur with a new chief minister and two deputy chief ministers in Senapati district, which is the northernmost district of Manipur, and Kampokpi district. And where is the epicenter of the violence today? It is in these two districts. What does this portray? The utter failure of the state government. I would want to put that on record in the first place. Second, I would also not hesitate to say that the NSCI-IM, which is notorious for carrying out violent acts despite the existence of a ceasefire with the government of India. Today, with its proxies, do not misquote or understand that ZUF, Zaleng United Front, has a faction today, and that faction is ZUF bracket Kamsong and ZUF bracket Jiangchui. These two factions are in connivance, or you say collusion, with the NSCI-IM and operating in the Kuki inhabited areas. Why I say this is because ZUF and NSCI-IM, along with the proxies that I just said, have been in conflict recently, and there has been constant firing amongst themselves. Now, third, look at the discourse of the present conflict. How this has been, not just how the so-called, the Manipur Nagas, let me be specific, the Manipur Nagas are trying to take this conflict to the other states. How the Zaleng community in Nagaland have been organizing protests against the Kukis in Nagaland. Mind you, there is a peace accord or understanding, MOU, signed between the Zaleng Nagas in Nagaland and the Kukis. Now imagine, the Kukis have never gone to Mizoram or never instigated the Mizoram people, because we are blood brothers, that you should stand with us to fight against this so-called the other community. Never. Let me put on the record, because there is an argument at all times, who is a peace-loving community. Now, the Naga United Naga Council, UNC Council President by the name Sok Wasun, when the killing of the Naga civilians happened, somewhere in Ukrul, I think it was towards the beginning of this month, or otherwise late April. Forgive me for the incorrect, because I don't want to cite any incorrect dates. Because by mistake, Naga civilians were killed, and the blame goes to the Kukis. Because this was again so-called Kuki-dominated areas. But the Kukis have unanimously stated that it was not their hand, but rather it was a misunderstanding between the NACIAN eastern flank and the NACIAN iron, which is again the faction of NACIAN that is operating in the northeast. The NACIAN eastern flank. Now, having understood all this, United Naga Council President Sun on that day, after the death of these civilians, put on record that swift action will be taken against the perpetrators without proving or providing the fact who was the perpetrator or the killer of those civilians. And eventually what followed, what transpired, series of events of violence in Kamjong and Ukrul, and also the one today of which we are holding a press conference, the death of our three beloved pastors. Now, we must trace the roots. Well, I will come on to that a little later, but please allow me to also demolish how this narrative of illegal immigrants, foreigners, tag that has been given to the Kukis by the so-called the very community, the Meiteis and the Nagas in Manipur. Now, let me debunk them one by one. First, 9 categories of primary source documentation. I'm not saying this quoting from a newspaper. I'm not saying this out of thin air, but I am citing a legible, a reliable document. First, you have the Taranathas, History of Buddhism, the Sri Rajmala Royal Chronicle of Tripura, the Territorial Kumbaba Royal Chronicle of Manipur, the Gazetteers of Manipur, 1886, Z.A. Gerson Linguistic Survey of India, the Proceedings of the Indian Historical Records Commission, colonial census reports spanning 1881 to 1951, and military operation records of the British collectively established one thing beyond dispute. That is, the Kuki people were here long before the British boots touched their soil, long before modern boundaries were drawn. Therefore, I can boldly say that the Kukis are never immigrants, illegal immigrants, or migrants, or foreigners, or illegal, whatever name you call it today. We are never a colonial invention. We are, in fact, truly the indigenous community and the people of this country and this state called Manipur today. Number 2, allow me to go phase by phase. Phase 1, let us go back a little back to history. The colonial wounds, 1935 to 1946. But mind you, before I stepped onto this, 1917-1919, the Anglo-Kuki War was the only, or let's call it the most formidable war ever fought by a tribal community against the British imperialism. On record, this has been recognized by Doungel India, and this is on record in the British Museum in London. Now, this colonial wounds, why I say this is coming back to 1935-1946. This was a time when the reserve forests, the protected forests, were declared over the Kuki ancestral land without the acknowledgement, without consulting the Kukis. the cookies who were administered under their chiefs. For example, Kangbung, Longza, Yangenching, Vangai, Kaimai, Tolbung, and others. These were declared reserve forests. These were declared protected forests without any compensation. This was the fault and the error of the colonial British. And this has led to what is called the extinguishing of our so-called cookie customary rights. And that's where the root began. Number two, after independence, what happened? At least 67 cookie villages. I repeat, 67 cookie villages in Thangminlal, the then Naga inhabited areas, Ukrul, Senapati, southern hills and including Territorial were uprooted, and families and the victims of this so-called atrocities by the then Nagas actually drove them out of India to flee to Burma to seek refuge. Now, what happened? Came the phase 3. Misrepresentation and migration. That was in the year 1967 and 1973 between. All of these so-called the cookie victims who went to Burma to seek refuge because of the turmoil and the instability of Burma had to return to India to cross the border. And that's where the so-called the cookie refugees, because of clerical error, was communicated by the DC to the SDO of the time, and that's where the Nagas and the Meiteis in Manipur have been basing their argument, saying that the cookies are refugees. But let me debunk the same accusation by these communities against the cookies, because at the same time in the parliamentary debates at that time, the parliament, the government of India did not use the word refugees. Rather, it says the repatriate Indians, and gave refuge and a place to stay in Manipur, welcoming them back to India. So therefore, the term called refugee has never been the so-called the official language of the government of India, but rather taken advantage by the so-called people, the community who wants to take advantage of the vulnerability of the cookies when they are at most dire need. Now, in fact, amongst those families that have gone, or those who seek shelter, sought shelter in Burma, were closest somewhere around 1,500 cookie families, which were safely repatriated to India by the government of India. Now coming back to the phase 4, the constitutional protection, and its quite encroachment. Now, on the paper, the rights of the cookies are protected, but go deeper, you will see there is a quite intrusion or encroachment into the land of the cookies. Let me cite few examples. Article 371C of the Indian Constitution, which is the Hill Areas Committee Order of 1972. By the way, 1972, Manipur became a full-fledged state. Imagine, when the state became a full-fledged state, there was this called Hill Area Committee Order by the then President of India, Article 371C, to protect the rights of the tribal communities, including the cookies and Naga in Manipur, specific to Manipur. What happened? That was done to protect their land system, their customary governance, their chiefs and headmen, and their autonomous institutions. However, in 2008, beginning 2008, through the office memorandum of 26 August 2008, this is for the press and media, please generously use it is signed when you report. Office Memorandum Order of 26 August 2008 and the subsequent allocation rules in Manipur authority over village creation, recognition and boundary alteration was quietly transferred to the revenue department. Quietly transferred without the knowledge of the Kuki chiefs and the Kuki traditional governing body. This was done, yes, including without the consultation of the Hill Areas Committee, which was empowered by the Constitution of India under Article 371C to protect the indigenous tribal communities in Manipur, hill tribal communities. Now, what that move culminated into 462 hill villages brought under valley-based revenue jurisdiction. Today, we talk about buffer zones. We talk about valleys and the peripheries. But on paper, most of the so-called these valley-based revenue jurisdiction actually overlaps even deep into the tribal hill areas, which was done without the knowledge of the tribal people. Then 20 instances of valley sub-registrar offices exercising jurisdiction over hill area lands, and 192 hill villages placed under valley police stations. These hill villages are now placed under the jurisdiction of the so-called the valley police. Now coming to the phase 5. This was the 1992-1993 ethnic conflict between the NAC and IM-led Nagas in Manipur and the Kukis. This has led to more than 1,000 Kuki innocent lives being lost. 360 villages uprooted. What was this done? This was done by the so-called the peace-loving. This was done by the so-called Greater Nagaland expansion ideology of the NAC and IM. Because if you are demanding for a land, if you are demanding for a separate country, you need land. And therefore, the only vulnerable victim that come closest to them were the Kukis, and hence the Kuki paid the price. This was done by the so-called those who claim to be peace-loving. And like I said, more than 1,000 lives lost, more than 360 Kuki villages, and even the Kuki women were raped, assaulted, physically assaulted. The modus operandi, therefore, is not different from today's so-called the modus operandi which was done by the Métis towards our Kuki women. Okay, coming to the sixth phase, the catastrophe that is still ongoing, coming to the present, since May 2023. More than 3,000 Kuki homes in Imphal Valley burned, looted, illegally occupied or destroyed. Imagine the entire community in the state capital being uprooted from the state. Has this ever happened in any of India? But tell me, is there any such incident elsewhere across the world? It only happens in India, and that too in Manipur, where the entire community cannot have access to the only state airport, means of transportation, which is a basic human rights, or basic human rights. More than 7,000 Kuki villages burned to ashes. More than 230, around more than 240 Kuki lives, innocent lives lost. 491 persons injured. 41,500 men, women and children forcibly displaced and not rehabilitated properly even today. And the IDPs have a spillover not just across Northeast, but also even in the state, in the capital city of India, that is New Delhi. So hence this is not a communal violence in ordinary sense. This is systemic or systematic destruction on a scale that demands to be called what it is today. And the cookies are again at the receiving end. Now, coming to the next, we have the present conflict. Let me take you a little back to the present conflict, because many think that the killing of the three pastors and the holding of hostages by these two different communities began on that day of the so-called ambush. It is not. Let me take you back to February of 2026. What began as a localized dispute in Litan, Sarekhu, this is in Ukhrul, followed a textbook escalation, customary resolution attempted, where negotiation collapsed, arrests were organized, an attack on the Kuki village chief residents, automatic gunfire near police stations by the so-called peace-loving community within 48 hours, and over 89 Kuki households had to be abandoned. And again in March 2026, what led us a local so-called misunderstanding again spiraled further on in March 2026, where the Doungel militants, NSAIM led, attacked Kuki villagers during Zoom cultivation. And here 2 innocent victims had to pay the price, who went to repair the village water pipe, to fix the water pipe because the drinking water, there was a shortage of drinking water, and by the name Thangboyma, Lunkim and Thinkukim Zaite had to pay the price. They were abducted and the bodies found next day. Then again in April 2026, attack on Kuki villages intensified. And on 24 April, the villages of Mulang, Songphel, Mongkochepu were attacked. 16 houses were burnt and 2 Kuki village volunteers were killed on their way to actually rescue the innocent villages of Mulang. They were again attacked through ambush by the so-called peace-loving NSAIM led militants. And 18 April, this was the incident that I talked about. Because of this misunderstanding, the blame goes to the Kukis, right? 18 April, Chinau Sang, Sokungnau, and Yurengam Bashum. These civilians were shot dead, and the blame was on the Kukis. But the Kukis counterclaimed that no, it was not our hand. Like I said, this was the spillover of the misunderstanding between NSNIM and the NSNIM Eastern Flank, the faction. Thinking that the tension between them should not escalate, somehow kill it out and ambush again, kill innocent villages of their own, and put the blame on the Kukis. That way they were able to de-escalate the tension between these two factions and within the communities in Ukhrul and Kamsong. Now again on 12 April, of course, now 12 April, village authority issued a formal notice barring Indian security forces. Now this is before the onset of what happened, the killing of the 2 innocent Tangko Nagas, but on 12 April, all of these were able to take place and were able to take place because of the so-called violence. So because of the local authorities dictate to the villages not to allow the security forces to enter the villages, and hence all of these ambush were able to take place. On the other hand, you use the civilians to seal the security forces. At the same time, you carry out the atrocities against the so-called your innocent, the other innocent villagers. Now, 13 May, that is the premeditated murder. I call it a premeditated murder because Reverend V. Sitlaw was a very prominent Kuki Joe pastor. He was also the General Secretary of the Manipur Baptist Convention, very influential, and he was a part of the Peace Commission that went to Kohima when tensions escalated between the Tangul Naga led and the Kukis in these districts. And coming back to the UNC President Sotwason, who was also a part of the contingent, did not sign the peace agreement in Kohima. Can you see the dots? And now connect the dots. Whereas the Kukis were willing to sign the peace agreement. Now, who is a peace-loving community and who is not stands out very clear. Now, let me conclude by saying that these are the demands. I know I take a little long time, but I don't want to keep you in a loop in confusion. And I want to bring that to clarity. That is why I took more time. And these are the demands of the Kuki-Ijo community. Enforcement of Article 371C. Strictly, Hill Areas Committee. Of course, now the demand has been upgraded through separate administration for the Kuki-Ijo. Number 2, a formal inquiry into the 1992-1993 violence as well. Because the NSNIM led atrocities, killing more than 1,000 innocent Kuki people. No one is until today held accountable. And the perpetrator, Mr. Muiba, is still alive. Number 3, complete rehabilitation of Kuki IDPs. Number 4, accountability for the 2026 attacks, and then unconditional release of the 16 Kuki hostages. And last of all, the demand is, at a time when Kukis face displacement, insecurity, and uncertainty, the failure to guarantee their safety and constitutional rights is a matter of profound concern. The protection of Kuki lives, land, and identity through appropriate constitutional safeguard is essential. And hence the Kuki unequivocally demand separate administration so that their constitutional rights are safeguarded and that they thrive just as the other Indians. So with that, I will close and thank you for your patient hearing.